Welcome back to Face the Nation. Well, here's something you don't see very often in Washington. These people have been lining up all weekend in hope of getting a seat in the Supreme Court arguments scheduled for Tuesday. This is a case that could ultimately settle whether the right to marry someone of the same sex is constitutionally protected. We're going to hear from both sides. Evan Wolfson is the head of Freedom to Marry, a group that's lobbied for gays to marry. He's in New York this morning, but I'm going to start with probably the most vocal opponent of same-sex marriage, and that is Tony Perkins. He is the president of the Family Research Council. And Ms. Perkins, I'm going to say this to you up front. You and your group have been so strong in coming out against this and against gay marriage that the Southern Poverty Law Center has branded the Family Research Council an anti-gay hate group. We have been inundated by people who say we should not even let you appear because they, in their view, quote, you don't speak for Christians. Do you think you have taken this too far?
No, Bob, we stand, well, first of all, let me say thank you for allowing us to continue to have this discussion, because I think it's a discussion that's going to continue on, regardless of what the court says. The court is not going to settle this issue. In fact, I think it does a disservice to both sides if the court weighs in on public policy like this. The courts are decided to interpret the Constitution and the constitutionality of laws, not create public policy. When they do that, they create division and they erect barriers to reaching consensus on public policy like this. And so no, we stand with millennia of experience that the union of a man and woman, the sacred union of marriage, is the cornerstone of society. That's where kids learn to become citizens.
Well, you said the other day, and I believe these are your words, if the court rules in favor of gay marriage, it would be open season on people of faith.
Absolutely.
I mean, how can you say that?
Oh, I can say it very clearly. When this is what's at stake here, Bob. This is not about the marriage altar. This is about fundamentally altering the culture. Just on Friday, a bakery in Oregon was fined $135,000 for not refusing to serve gay people, but simply saying, we cannot participate in a same-sex wedding because it violates our Christian faith. $135,000. Within hours, though, about $100,000 was raised for this couple until gay activists demanded that GoFundMe take down their site.
But, you know, Mr. Perkins, in the 2 years since the court took up this issue, we now have surveys that show that 6 in 10 Americans now favor gay marriage. That says to me this may be working. 37 states in the district have now legalized same-sex marriage. It is illegal in just 7 states. Doesn't that mean that people want this to be legal?
No, first off, even the Washington Post said the numbers are based on how you ask the question. The nation really is evenly divided. And the narrative 37 states, that works for those who want to say the consensus is on the side of redefinition. But you have to realize only voters in 3 of those states actually voted to allow the redefinition of marriage. In the vast majority of the others, it's been imposed on them by the courts. And for those that would say there's a global consensus, that's not true either. Only 17 of the 193 member states of the United Nations have redefined marriage, and only 1, Brazil, is the only nation that's allowed it to be done by the courts. The court will only supercharge this issue as they did Roe v. Wade back in 1973.
Did you really say that justices who come down on the side of gays on this should be impeached?
No, I didn't say that.
Because there are reports to that effect.
No, I didn't say that.
What did you say?
Well, I said that I didn't say anything about impeachment of the judges. What I said that they're not the final say on this issue. In our system of government, the courts are not the final say on issues. And for the court to decide on something like this and impose it on the nation, which the polling, even CBS's own polling says a majority of Americans are opposed to the idea that the Supreme Court would impose this on the nations. They think it's best left to the states. That's how we come to a consensus in this country. And as abortion remains an issue 42 years later, in every election from president on down, it'll continue to be an issue, just as the major Republican candidates last night in Iowa made it an issue.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Perkins, for being with us. And now we go to New York and Evan Wolfson, who is head of Freedom to Marry. Well, you just heard what one of the main opponents to this says, Mr. Wolfson. What's your side of the story here?
Well, I would say that Tony Perkins is really an outlier, and what's to be celebrated here is that the vast majority of Americans have opened their hearts and changed their mind and moved forward to embrace the freedom to marry, and the courts are following where that public opinion has gone. And the reason that's happened is because gay people and non-gay people have talked about shared values of treating others as you'd want to be treated. We've talked about our love, our commitment, real families, not just stereotypes and insinuations. And the American people have moved. And that's to be celebrated, and that's why we feel such hope going into this day in court that we'll be having later this week.
Let me ask you this question. I mean, the polls do show 6 in 10 Americans do favor gay marriage now. But regardless of what you may think of Tony Perkins and his group, there are some very sincere, thoughtful people that are on both sides of this issue. What do you say? What is your message to the 4 in 10 who do not favor gay marriage?
You're absolutely right that not everybody opposed or not with us is somebody like Tony Perkins. You're right that there are people who are still thinking it through, and the good news in America is people do think it through and they do move. And I'm confident that these people will see what the majority of Americans have come to see, which is that when we end discrimination, when we end exclusion, families are helped and no one's hurt. You know, last week the Williams Institute, Bob, released a poll showing that in every single state where we brought the freedom to marry, support has gone up. People, when they get a chance to see it for real and to open their hearts and to talk to their neighbors, understand that civil rights advances like this are good. They're good for the community, they're good for the country, they're good for the Constitution, and they're certainly good for families.
What do you think has been the thing that has caused a lot of people to change their mind on this?
The overwhelming engine of change here has been conversation. It's been gay people talking about love, talking about commitment, talking about why marriage matters, the reality of our lives, talking about how the exclusion and discrimination has really harmed us in tangible and intangible ways. And it's also been non-gay people being willing to be part of those conversations and thinking about shared values. Millions of conversations over many, many battles have led to this momentum. And and the fact that
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, the fact that we've now seen in the last 2 years more than 60 courts, state and federal courts, Republican judges as well as Democratic, ruling in favor of the freedom to marry is because the courts, like the country, have come to understand that the command of the Constitution does apply to gay people like other Americans.
None of us who have ever had any experience in sitting in a courtroom and watching a trial, or whether it's at the lowest level or at the Supreme Court, knows better than try to guess what the outcome is going to be. But the opinion seems to be that the court is going to rule in your favor on this. But I guess I would ask you this: what happens if they don't?
Yeah. Well, you know, actually 15 years ago today was the day I got to argue in the Supreme Court on the Boy Scout case. And one of the lessons I learned going into the court was count to 5. What it comes down to in the Supreme Court is, will we have 5 justices at least who are ready to rule for us? And of course, we've done everything we can to make the case not only in the court, but in the country, in the court of public opinion, to create the climate for the court to do the right thing. If the court doesn't do the right thing this time, we will keep working. We will build on the progress we've made. We will continue engaging our fellow Americans. We will continue the strategy of winning more states and winning more hearts and minds, and we'll go back before, if necessary, another set of justices. But I'm very, very hopeful that this set of justices will see what all these other judges and what the majority of Americans have seen. It's time to end the freedom to marry, the exclusion from marriage. It's time for the freedom to marry.
All right. Well, Mr. Wolfson, thank you again for joining us, and we'll come back in a minute with our panel of analysts. They have all the answers. Back now with our panel. Kimberly Strassel is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Peter Baker is White House correspondent for the New York Times, and last night he won the Aldo Beckman Award for distinguished reporting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Congratulations to you, Peter. Aldo Beckman was a friend of mine. And
that's good to hear.
He's a great guy. Ruth Marcus, columnist for the Washington Post, and CBS News political director John Dickerson here, getting used to getting up every Sunday morning, every Sunday morning, even the Sunday morning after the White House Correspondents' Dinner. The truth of the matter is I may still be at the White House. I'm not quite sure where I am this morning, but it's an amazing evening. I'm in a town that generally goes to bed at 9 o'clock. If people stay out past midnight. Ruth, just as you were sitting down here, you told me something that I never knew. You went to school with Evan Wolfson, who's heading up the Right to Marry thing.
Did, and when Evan, we went to college and law school together, and in law school he wrote his third-year paper, as was required, on the then fanciful and outlandish subject of whether there was a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. This was viewed as so out there that it was hard for him to find a faculty advisor, he told me later. And now I think you mentioned how difficult and dangerous it is to predict things. How amazing is it that many, many years later, I think we're not even that much on tenterhooks about what the Supreme Court's going to do. It seems almost inevitable.
Will this still be an issue in the campaign in 2016?
It depends on what the ruling is. Let's talk about it on the Republican side, where it's complex. You have all of the Republican candidates running for president would like the Supreme Court to uphold these state bans on same-sex marriage. That's what they've said, both as a matter of their own faith and also as a matter of the way they see the Constitution. I think politically speaking, purely politically for Republicans, there's a challenge. On the one hand, they have the party, some believe, has an image problem, and that support or at least openness to same-sex marriage is a part of the wave of the future, and the party needs to be somehow associated with that. Particularly young Republicans are very much in favor of same-sex marriage. Not older Republicans, but younger Republicans, and that's the future. The tension, of course, though, is there is a group of people in the Republican Party for whom this is a faith question, and this is a sincere, as you mentioned, matter of their belief. And it's not just about redefining marriage, as they put it, but it's about the values that are being destroyed by the culture. And that's a group that Republicans are trying to talk to as they make their case for the presidency. So that's where it'll be interesting to see how that tension plays out.
You know, Kim, so many of these would-be Republican candidates, they're really dancing around this issue, and I don't mean that with any disrespect, but they are. I mean, those who say that, well, I'm against same-sex marriage, but the question of the month has been, but would you go to a gay marriage? That's kind of seems to be the threshold question now.
Well, that question is sort of strange to me because it just seems to be restating the question of, are you in favor of gay marriage? This tension that John mentions is not necessarily new. I mean, you've always had these different factions within the Republican Party. Those are defense hawks, those who are, fiscal conservatives, those are social conservatives, and you have these splits. So I think one of the interesting things here is, how is the court going to rule? They're going to want very much for it to be a states' rights question. And I don't think, by the way, that is still out of the realm of possibility. People are talking about Anthony Kennedy being the final deciding vote on this, and he has been very sympathetic to gay marriage in past decisions, but he's also a big fan of states' rights. And there are two questions that the court is looking at. One is there a constitutional right to this? But the second one is there the 14th Amendment, does it require states to recognize gay marriages from out of states? And there is a scenario you could see in which they ruled no in the first question and yes in the second.
I think this is going to be something, no matter what the court rules, we'll be talking about it just in the same way that we talk about a woman's right to choose and all of that. There's just a divide here, and there are sincere people. Truly,
I don't think it's going to be the same roiling and really tearing apart society question that abortion has been since Roe v. Wade. There are sincere differences on both of those issues, but society remains incredibly split on the right to abortion. I think for the reasons that John mentioned, because the demographics are in favor of same-sex marriage, it is not going to be as
but you
societally
also have to ask
split.
the question, though. I think maybe one of the reasons that this has played out better is because the courts have not been as aggressively involved, and the states were making their own. You keep pointing out to those polls, America's got to that position on its own, largely. And I think there is an issue about whether or not, if the court does impose something here, you do end up in another Roe v. Wade situation, and it polarizes the situation.
Although it's interesting, the court actually set this up in an interesting way. 2 years ago, it sort of gave a half decision that then gave license to all these lower courts to decide that same-sex marriage had to be allowed over the voters who had passed these bans in their state constitution. So 30-some states now have same-sex marriage, but not because of the action of democracy, not through legislative actions, but through lower courts that took their cue from the Supreme Court. And now, in effect, the Supreme Court has set it up so that if they decide to, they're coming back and ratifying a decision that they made 2 years ago that was then interpreted by lower courts.
And without a huge societal backlash.
And without a big, huge backlash, but some backlash.
I wanted to just suggest 2 questions in addition to the would you go to a same-sex wedding question for candidates. And one is the Republican Party platform in 2012 endorses a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage. Is that the view of Republican candidates today? Number 2, there are no job discrimination or housing discrimination protections in federal law on the basis of sexual orientation. Do you think that that's fair in 2016?
Let me just shift. An excellent discussion on that. But I wouldn't call this bulletin matter, but there is some news this morning on the Clinton Foundation front. The Clinton Foundation has put up a message on its website saying, yes, we made mistakes, as many organizations of our size do, but we are acting quickly to remedy them and have taken steps to ensure they don't happen in the future. This obviously has to do with these donations that were coming in to the foundation from overseas groups and so forth while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and after. Peter?
Yeah, I think, look, this is a big issue for Hillary Clinton because, in fact, it goes back to some of the issues we've been seeing with the Clintons going to the 90s, which is the interaction between money and politics, money and the Clintons in particular. And they have arguments about why they made some of the decisions they made, and they have made some mistakes on some of the others. But broadly, I think it fits into a narrative that she's going to have to work hard to shake, which is that they are so tied in with moneyed interests, with people who have perhaps more than one motive in giving to a philanthropy, and in some ways it neutralizes to some extent the argument that they would like to make about the Koch brothers and the funders on the right who are going to be obviously participating in the politics as well. And I don't know where the voters go with this. It's be interesting to see how they decide to settle this.
Oh, when they say we made some mistakes and we're going to correct them, Kim, what in your view would they need to do?
It's all a mistake. I mean, look, the issue here, the Clinton pushback on this now is there's not a shred of evidence that we did anything wrong. It's not about the evidence, it's about the appearance of conflict of interest, and everyone else seems to understand that this is a huge problem other than the Clintons. I mean, even the Obama administration said you have to sign up for these disclosure rules, you have to stop foreign money because we understand that this is a problem. But the Clintons seem to think that the normal rules don't apply to them.
Today they put out the statement that said, well, yes, we did make
They've
mistakes.
got to stop all donations.
And you think they should stop it?
Yeah, they have to.
Should they
How can
give
you have
some
a
back?
president of the United States who in any capacity is tied to a foundation that's receiving money from corporations or foreign governments, and that question of appearance of conflict not be present?
Should they give back what they've already got?
Yes.
You think so?
I think it's hard to unring that bell. 3 quick points here. One is, despite a lot of kind of smarmy suggestiveness, there is no evidence, and I think it's important to say this, of any kind of quid pro quo of official action in return for donations. Number 2, this is a problem, I agree with what was said, that is inherent in the nature of having an ex-president raising large amounts of money for a good cause while his wife is A, the Secretary of State, and B, a presidential candidate. So this was going to be a problem from the get-go. And C, or 3, wherever I am, sorry, the notion of the sloppiness and the greed that follows on this sloppiness with failing to report donations or failing to get your tax returns right or failing to comply with the rules, and greed in terms of taking donations from particularly questionable people is simply inexcusable.
It seems to me that as a purely political question, the voters have to figure out something. What this goes to is if there is no quid pro quo, if there's no proof that money came in and a decision was made, there is this question of trust. Can the Clintons be trusted to follow the rules, especially when they're making some of their own rules? And that has to do not just with the foundation and whether they abided by the agreements with the Obama administration, but of course with the emails as well. So it also in weird ways becomes a trust question when Hillary Clinton is presenting herself as a van-driving, Chipotle-eating candidate. Is that at odds with the stories of $500,000 speaking fees? So it's a trust.
That was on the low end.
Even President Obama's joke last night says, I obviously the economy is not doing too terribly, because in fact I have a friend who used to be making millions and now she's living in a van in Iowa.
So
that joke actually kind of highlights that very tension you're
So the
talking
question is trust on that. That's the downside for Hillary Clinton. But voters are going to say, but who cares about me? And on that question, so far, she does very well. So voters could very well find themselves in the position where they don't trust her so much, but they think that she understands their lives and cares about them, and they're willing to forgive the one because they like the other. That seems to me the question we'll have to watch going forward.
Well, we're going to be talking about this for a long time, and it's an issue that certainly is not going to go away, and certainly this is not what the Clinton campaign at this point wanted to be talking about. We're going to come back, if I can stay awake, with some of the best moments from last night's White House Correspondents' dinner. Stay with us. Last night was the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Washington politicians and the media mixed with Hollywood, but it was President Obama who stole the show.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the night when Washington celebrates itself. Somebody's got to do it. Now, look, it is true I have not managed to make everybody happy. 6 years into my presidency, some people still say I'm arrogant and aloof, condescending. Some people are so dumb. No wonder I don't meet with them. And that's not all people say about me. A few weeks ago, Dick Cheney says he thinks I'm the worst president of his lifetime. Which is interesting because I think Dick Cheney is the worst president of my lifetime. Quite a coincidence. It gets worse. Just this week, Michelle Bachmann actually predicted that I would bring about the biblical end of days. Now that's a legacy. That's big. I mean, Lincoln, Washington, they didn't do that. But, you know, I just had to put this stuff aside. I've got to stay focused on my job because for many Americans, this is still a time of deep uncertainty. For example, I have one friend, just a few weeks ago, she was making millions of dollars a year, and she's now living out of a van in Iowa.
And we'll be back in a minute. Thanks for joining us. We'll all be wide awake and back here next week for another Face the Nation. Thanks for joining us.